She opened her diner to 12 stranded truck drivers. And what happened next changed her. They were already closing for the night when Grace first saw them. Shadows moving through white. 12 men, hunched against the wind, their heavy boots dragging through the thick snow like they'd been walking for hours. She stood frozen behind the glass door of the diner, one hand still on the open sign she was about to flip. The wind howled, slamming against the windows as if trying to get in with them. Grace didn't think. She didn't calculate how many cans of soup were left or how little heat the old furnace had left to give. She just opened the door. One by one, they came in, shoulders dusted with snow, eyes sunken with exhaustion, voices low and polite like they already knew they were asking for too much. But they weren't. Not tonight. Not while she was still standing. Thomas didn't speak. He watched from the back booth, same one he always sat in, tucked into the corner where no one could look directly at him unless they tried. He didn't try anymore. Not since the accident. Not since the highway took more than just his leg. Grace had almost forgotten the way he used to light up when someone said mile marker 83 or I-40 near Amarillo. Back when his voice used to echo across states, scratchy and sure, over CB radio waves. Back when people called him Voice Walker. But tonight, he just sat there, cardigan wrapped around his shoulders like a shell. The little diner, Grace and Thomas's diner, hadn't seen this many boots in months. Not since the state decided to cut a new highway 6 miles west. Not since trucks stopped pulling in for hot coffee and eggs and a place to shake the cold off their bones. Grace fought it as long as she could. Cooked through the silence, smiled through the debt letters, cleaned counters no one sat at. Most days, the only sound came from the old ceiling fan spinning lazily, like even it had given up. The pantry shelves were nearly bare. 3 cans of soup, half a loaf of stale rye, and a sack of potatoes she'd been saving for their own dinner tomorrow. The coffee pot sputtered like it was dying too, but she served what she had. She found an old pan of cornbread she had forgotten in the warmer. She poured the last of the tomato soup into cracked ceramic bowls. The men didn't ask for more. They ate slowly, gratefully, warming their hands on the mugs, leaning back into their coats like they were afraid to believe they'd found shelter. She noticed a kid among them, young, maybe 20, maybe less. Eyes too big for his face. He didn't touch his sandwich, just stared at Thomas like he knew him from somewhere. Thomas didn't look back. He hadn't looked at anyone directly since the wheelchair. The snow didn't stop. It kept falling like the world was trying to cover itself. Outside, the road vanished, just white stretching into nothing. Inside, the diner breathed again. Faint at first, but then deeper, warmer. Grace moved between tables with practiced ease. Leo, right behind her, hands trembling slightly as he balanced plates. He'd only been working there 6 months. She'd hired him when his father's shop went under. Kid could barely boil an egg when he started, but he never complained. Just kept trying. She looked over and caught him staring at the group, something flickering in his face, maybe fear, maybe awe. She didn't ask. She just handed him another bowl of soup. The youngest driver finally leaned forward, elbows on the counter, and said softly, "You're him, aren't you?" It was barely above a whisper. Thomas didn't react. The boy tried again. Voice Walker. You used to guide people through storms. A pause. Then another driver, a big guy, beard like snow-covered wire, let out a short, surprised laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. That's him. You walked me through black ice in Idaho. 97. Your voice kept me from driving straight off a cliff." The diner went still. Even the wind outside seemed to quiet. Thomas blinked, looked up, just for a second. Grace saw it, the flicker in his eyes. Recognition. Pain. Something buried, clawing its way to the surface. He didn't speak. Not yet. But Grace saw his hand twitch on the edge of the table. Like muscle memory, remembering a mic that wasn't there. She didn't say anything. She just turned and poured more coffee. Hot, strong, almost bitter. The kind truckers liked. The kind Thomas used to drink with both hands cupped around the mug, like it could anchor him to the moment. The boy smiled faintly, leaned back. My dad used to say if Voice Walker was on the air, you weren't really lost. Thomas blinked again. This time, something softened. The night stretched on. The food ran low. The stories grew louder. Boots stomped. Laughs echoed. and slowly the cold began to lose. For the first time in months, Grace stopped checking the door. She stopped thinking about the highway that stole their customers or the mortgage she couldn't pay. She stopped thinking about losing the diner, about losing Thomas, because for the first time in a long time, the place felt alive again. And in the back corner, beneath the low hum of voices and the smell of burnt coffee and snow-wet denim, Thomas finally moved. His hand reached out, brushing across the old radio mic hanging from a hook beneath the counter. His fingers curled around it, not to speak, not yet, but like he was remembering how it felt to hold something that mattered. Grace watched him from behind the counter. She didn't smile. Not yet. But her chest ached in that quiet, dangerous way that hope always did. Because maybe, just maybe, this storm hadn't come to bury them. Maybe it had come to bring something back. The first one in was Ray, but he wasn't alone for long. 5 minutes later, another set of boots stomped through the door. Then, 3 more. By the time Grace turned back from the kitchen, there were 12 men sitting or standing inside her quiet little diner. She didn't ask their names. She didn't ask how they got here or why they kept coming. She just nodded, rolled up her sleeves, and went to the pantry. There was no plan, no grand moment of decision. Just motion, habit, a kind of stubborn instinct to serve. She counted what was left without really seeing it. 4 eggs, half a bag of rice, 2 cans of chicken broth, a nearly empty sack of flour. She grabbed everything without thinking and started cooking. Leo stood frozen for a second, then moved in beside her. Together they worked in silence, as if the ticking of the clock was louder than the wind. Thomas stayed in his corner. He watched the way the snow slid off their jackets, the way they shook their hands and stretched their backs like they were trying to find the road in their bones. He didn't speak. Not yet. But Grace caught him looking, really looking, not just at the men, but at their faces, at their eyes, at the way they gravitated toward the heat like moths who still remembered light. She slid the first plate across the counter, grilled bread, thin sliced potatoes fried in butter, a spoonful of canned beans, and one of the men took it with both hands like it was a gift. The next plate went to the kid who hadn't said a word since he came in. His fingers were red from the cold. Grace gave him an extra slice of bread. Leo kept the coffee going. He didn't speak either. He was trying not to show how scared he was. Scared they'd run out. Scared the heater would go. Scared this whole night was the end of something none of them wanted to name. The men ate slowly, grateful. No one complained. No one asked for more. When the bread ran out, Grace sliced the hamburger buns and toasted them dry on the grill. When the soup got low, she added hot water and stirred in crushed crackers. No one said anything, but their silence felt like respect. Outside, the storm pounded harder. Inside, time stretched. The only sound was the quiet scrape of forks and the soft hum of tired voices trying to make each other laugh. That's when Thomas shifted. It was small, barely noticeable, but Grace saw it. His shoulder moved, just slightly, like something inside him was waking up. A man sitting near the heater turned to him and nodded once. Recognition, not of face, but of presence. Like he knew him, or maybe used to. Thomas didn't nod back, but his eyes lingered. Grace poured him a fresh cup of coffee and set it near the edge of his table. He didn't reach for it, just stared at it for a long time, steam curling around his reflection. One of the drivers pulled a harmonica out of his jacket pocket and started playing. Soft, out of tune, but it filled the room like heat. Someone laughed. Another man clapped along, off rhythm. The storm kept going. So did they. Grace felt her body moving before her thoughts caught up. She was already back in the kitchen pulling out the last 2 meat loaves from the freezer, the ones she'd planned for herself and Thomas that weekend. She unwrapped them, threw them in the oven. Leo didn't say a word, just started peeling the last potatoes. There were no more eggs, no more bread, but they kept going. And with each plate that left the kitchen, something else came back. Grace looked up once and saw Thomas talking. Just a few words. Nothing big, but his lips were moving. His hands weren't clenched. He was speaking to someone sitting across from him, a man with silver in his beard and mud on his boots. The man was nodding, listening, smiling. Thomas didn't smile back, but he wasn't looking down. And that, for Grace, was enough. Leo burned his hand, pulling a pan from the oven. He cursed under his breath, but when Grace reached for it, he shook his head and kept going. His eyes were glassy. Grace didn't ask if it was the pain. It didn't matter. They were running on fumes. But they were still running. One of the truckers stood and stretched, then took his plate to the sink and washed it himself. Another followed. Grace tried to stop them, said don't worry about it, but the man smiled. We've all been where you are, he said. Tonight, we're not customers. We're just people. Thomas heard that. His head tilted slightly. That was the first moment Grace noticed he wasn't gripping the edge of the table like he usually did when the pain flared. She let that sink in. The furnace sputtered once and groaned. Everyone froze. The driver closest to it moved fast. Ray. He kneeled, popped open the front panel, and disappeared behind it. The silence returned. Grace held her breath. Thomas watched with that same old look he used to get before making a call on the road. Measured, alert, half expecting something to go wrong, but hoping it wouldn't. The furnace clanked. Then, after a minute, coughed to life again. Heat rushed out like breath. A cheer went up. Not loud, not childish. Just men tired of cold, grateful for warmth, laughing because they were still here. Grace didn't cheer. She just exhaled and kept slicing potatoes. They were out of almost everything now. The pantry was empty. The back fridge was silent. But Grace wasn't thinking about tomorrow. Tomorrow could bury itself in snow for all she cared. Tonight mattered, because tonight 12 men found a place to sit and thaw out their bones. Because tonight Thomas spoke. He didn't tell a story. Not yet. But he asked someone where they were headed. He said out loud. And when that man answered, Thomas nodded like he understood the shape of the road in his head. Grace leaned against the counter and watched it happen. Watched the way the kid, Leo, kept glancing over at Thomas like he couldn't believe the old man was still in there somewhere. Watched the way Thomas adjusted in his seat like he was listening with more than his ears. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The snow kept falling. The food was gone, but something else had taken its place. Something you couldn't eat, couldn't pour in a cup or wrap in foil. And still, it filled every corner of the diner. She looked around the room, saw coats hung near the door, boots lined up like they belonged there. Saw a circle forming around Thomas, quiet but steady. And in that circle, something alive. Something returning. A voice. A presence. A man. Not just the body in the wheelchair, but the one who used to hold a nation of strangers together by the sound of his voice. Grace didn't dare speak. She was afraid if she did, the spell would break. So she stayed still. She watched, and she hoped. Not because she believed in miracles, but because sometimes all you have left is one more night. And if that night is shared, if it means something to someone other than yourself, then maybe, just maybe, it was enough. The meatloaf was gone. Every last slice. The soup pot scraped clean. Bread reduced to heels. The coffee ground stretched thin, bitter by the third refill. Grace stood behind the counter, staring into the pantry like it might offer something she'd missed, something hidden in the shadows that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. There was nothing, not even a can of corn. Leo watched her silently. He didn't ask, just wiped his hands on his apron and turned back to the sink. The plates kept coming in, and he kept washing. The truckers, full but not satisfied, settled into the warmest corners of the diner, talking in low voices, some already stretching out their jackets as makeshift blankets across booth seats. Grace stepped in the back room, opened the old freezer. 2 frozen meat patties, a bag of mixed vegetables, freezer burned and hard as stone. She grabbed them anyway. Anything that could be boiled or fried, or turned into just one more plate. The furnace coughed once, then gave up. The silence that followed was sharp, immediate. The kind of silence you hear with your skin before your ears. Ray was already moving. Didn't wait for anyone to ask. He knelt beside the old heater, tools jangling from his coat pocket, and popped the panel. The lights dimmed slightly. Grace stepped out, brushing frost from her arms. "Can you fix it?" she asked, already knowing it was a stupid question. Ray didn't look up. "I can buy us some time," he muttered. "But it's on borrowed legs, like most of us in this room." Leo stayed close to the kitchen, arms folded, eyes on the back of the diner where Thomas hadn't moved. He'd stopped talking again, back into his silence, as if the moment had passed and he'd slipped back under. Leo hated that. Hated how easily it happened. How fast a man could go from being someone to being no one. He remembered a night 5 years ago. A car twisted around a telephone pole. His mother's hand in his lap. His father's chest crushed against the steering wheel. He remembered the sound of glass cracking above his head, the red light spinning outside the window, the voice on the CB radio that somehow cut through the chaos. Calm, certain, mile marker 112, I've got eyes on you. Helps 10 minutes out. Stay awake, kid. He'd never seen the man behind that voice. Until he walked into Grace's diner 6 months ago and saw a man in a wheelchair staring at nothing. The same voice, only quieter, like something sacred had been buried alive. Ray came out 5 minutes later, grease on his jacket sleeve, hands smudged. It'll hold for a while, he said. No one asked how long. Grace nodded once, poured a round of coffee that no one drank. They were running on fumes. That much was clear. Leo stood in the back room, hands pressed against the cold metal of the freezer. He didn't cry. He'd done that already, years ago, in the hallway of a hospital that smelled like bleach and plastic. But he breathed hard, thought about leaving, about walking out the door and pretending this place had never mattered. But the thought of Thomas, of what he used to be, kept him still. Back in the diner, the wind screamed again. One of the windows shivered in its frame. One of the truckers, quiet guy, no name given, pulled his coat tighter around him and muttered, "Hell of a night to run out of heat." No one answered. They didn't need to. Grace set another pot of water to boil. It didn't matter that there was nothing left to cook. The sound of boiling filled space. Made people think warmth was coming. Thomas looked up, just once, at Leo. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Recognition. Not of names, but of need. Leo broke it first. Went back to washing dishes like it was the only thing keeping him from coming undone. Thomas sat straighter. His hand drifted toward the old CB mic beneath the counter. He didn't touch it. Just let his fingers hover over the dust-covered plastic like he was remembering what it used to mean. Ray leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "We could try to radio out," he said softly. "Let someone know we're short on heat, food, backup." Grace shook her head. "And say what? That we fed 12 men with nothing and hoped someone noticed." Ray didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't believe anyone would come. Not out here. Not in this. Thomas blinked. His hand dropped. Grace turned away, her throat tight. She didn't want them to see her face. The room dimmed again. The electricity wavered. Someone muttered a curse. Another man crossed himself quietly. The kind of gesture you make not for God, but for the part of yourself that still believes he's listening. Leo stepped outside for air. Just a minute. That's all he needed. Snow whipped across his face like knives. But he didn't flinch. He stared into the white, remembering the voice. The one that found him in the dark. The one that stayed calm when everything else fell apart. He walked back in and crossed the room. Stopped in front of Thomas. His voice didn't shake. "You saved my life once," he said. Everyone looked up. Thomas didn't. 5 years ago. Car crash. Middle of nowhere. Your voice kept me awake. Told me not to fall asleep. Silence stretched. Grace froze behind the counter. "My mom died on impact. My dad didn't make it. But I did. Because of you." Thomas looked up. Really looked. His mouth opened slightly. No words. Just breath. Just shock. Leo didn't wait for more. "I never said thank you." Then he turned and went back to the sink. The dishes weren't done. They never were. But for the first time since he started working there, his hands weren't shaking. Thomas looked at the mic again. Then at Grace. Then back at the room. These weren't strangers anymore. They were people with stories that crossed his wants. People who remembered him when he didn't remember himself. He reached out, picked up the mic. The truckers watched, quiet. Ray stepped closer, unsure. Grace didn't move. The mic clicked once. Static filled the room. Not much, just enough to make them remember. Thomas cleared his throat. "If anyone's out there," he said slowly, "this is Walker at Grace's diner. Got 12 men sheltering from the storm. Food's low. Heat's dying. But we're still here." He let go. Set the mic down. No response. Just the hum of old wires and air thick with memory. But that moment, it was enough. For Leo. For Grace. For everyone. Because something had shifted. Something had returned. Not the power, not the food, but the voice, the man, the reason they were still holding on. The radio crackled once and fell quiet. No answer, no voice calling back through the static. Just the hiss of electricity trying to find something to hold on to. Thomas didn't expect anyone to respond. That wasn't the point. He didn't even know what compelled him to speak. Maybe it was Leo. Maybe it was the silence finally becoming too heavy to carry. Maybe it was the way Grace looked at him, not with pity, but with something else. Something older. The kind of belief you only reserve for someone you once built a life with. The truckers didn't say much after that. A few went back to their spots. Others huddled closer to the windows. The storm kept blowing. The heater kept wheezing. Grace stood still, a towel in her hand, unmoving, watching him like she was afraid he'd disappear again if she looked away. Then one of them, tall man, wide shoulders, beard thick with snowmelt, stepped forward from the back table. He squinted hard at Thomas, like his brain was pulling up a name it hadn't used in years. His voice cut through the air. "You wait a damn minute. You're him, aren't you?" CB Handel was voice walker. The room paused. Heads turned. No one breathed. Thomas froze, but he didn't look away. The man kept going. It was Montana, winter of '98. Blizzard hit so fast the highway turned into a whiteout. Radio towers were dead. Everyone was panicking. Then this voice cuts through like it wasn't even bothered. "Mile marker by mile marker, you walked me out of that mess. I swear, if it weren't for you, I'd still be buried under that snow." He stepped closer, pointed a thick finger like the memory was still burning in his chest. "You saved me." Thomas didn't speak. His hands gripped the edge of the table again, like he was holding the moment together with muscle alone. A second driver chimed in from a corner. "Voice walker, that's what we called you. Back in the day, you were legend. You had that calm tone, like the road couldn't touch you. I was hauling through Texas, hit black ice, spun out near Amarillo. Thought I was going to lose it. Then I hear, 'Don't fight it. Ease off. Let the wool talk.' I did, and I'm still here." Another voice joined, then another, like a dam breaking, a chorus of stories spilling out. A broken axle in Nebraska, a jackknife near Flagstaff, an engine fire in Wyoming. Each one tethered to the same voice, the same calm in the chaos. The same man who now sat in silence, his eyes wide, jaw locked like he couldn't quite believe any of it had happened. Thomas had never seen these men before, not in person, but their words came back to him like echoes in a canyon. He hadn't forgotten the roads, just the people, just the way they remembered him. Grace put a hand on the counter, not for balance, just to feel something solid under her. Her fingers trembled. She watched the lines in his face start to shift, watched the way his shoulders sank, not in defeat, but in release, in recognition. For years, Thomas had carried that accident like a death sentence. Not just the metal and blood and bone, but the silence that followed, the stillness, the feeling that the man he was had died somewhere out on that curve and never come home. But now, one story at a time, that version of him returned. Not with noise, not with grand gestures, just through memory, through voices that remembered when he couldn't. Leo stood by the sink, not moving. He didn't smile, didn't blink. He just let the moment wrap around him like armor. Because this wasn't about heroism. It wasn't about a man saving lives. It was about connection, about someone being there when no one else was. Grace stepped out from behind the counter. She didn't speak, just walked over and sat beside Thomas. Her hand found his. He didn't pull away. He didn't speak either, but he smiled. Not the forced kind, not the polite twitch he gave strangers. A real smile, one that cracked open his face, made him look younger somehow. Like the years had peeled back for a second. Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. She didn't try to hide it. The room stayed still, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. That's full by itself. One of the older drivers stepped forward. He was holding something in his hand. A CB mic, old, beat up, the rubber cord cracked, the metal chipped. He placed it gently on the table in front of Thomas. "You gave me this," he said, "back in '92. Mine had shorted during a storm. You pulled over, handed me yours, and said, 'Better you than silence.' I kept it all these years. Figured it was time to bring it home." Thomas stared at it. The mic looked exactly the same. like it had waited all this time just to come back to him. He reached out slowly, as if afraid it would vanish. His fingers brushed aside, then closed around it. His grip tightened. He didn't speak. He couldn't, but something inside him clicked back into place. Grace saw it. Everyone did. Ray stepped closer, grinning. Told you this place wasn't done yet. Laughter broke out, not loud, not wild. Just enough to cut through the tightness in everyone's chest. Thomas turned toward the man who gave back the mic. Thank you, he said. Just 2 words, but they were enough. Grace leaned in and whispered, You're still him, you know. You never stop being him. Thomas looked down at the mic, then around the room. Maybe, he said, but tonight, I remembered why it mattered. And for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel like a man stuck in a chair or buried under a memory. He felt like someone who could still reach people, who could still guide them home. And just like that, the weight he'd been dragging for years began to lift. Grace held his hand tighter, and this time he held back. No one asked if they could stay. They just did. Coats draped over chairs, boots pushed under booths, hands curled under heads like pillows. The diner transformed quietly, not by decision, but necessity. Grace found a box of old blankets in the storage closet behind the kitchen. Thin, scratchy, but warm enough. She handed them out one by one without a word. No one refused. They took them with quiet nods and murmured thanks, like soldiers in a trench knowing morning was still too far off. Leo laid out napkins as makeshift pillows. A few men grabbed extra menus to block the window drafts. Ray helped pull tables together to make more space near the heater, which still rumbled faintly, like it was trying its best to stay alive just a little longer. Thomas didn't move from his booth, but he stayed awake, eyes scanning the room, watching the way people folded into comfort they hadn't expected to find. Grace returned to the back one more time. She opened the last cabinet. There, tucked behind an old first aid kit and a broken toaster, was a box she had set aside 3 months ago. Emergency food, 2 cans of baked beans, a jar of peanut butter, 3 packs of instant noodles, and a small chocolate bar she'd been saving for Thomas's birthday. She hesitated, looked at the label. Expiration was still good. Her fingers closed around the chocolate, then let go. She carried it all back out in a crate, set it down on the counter. Leo looked up, eyes wide. That's for us, he whispered. Was. Grace didn't blink. Tonight, we're all in the same storm. She boiled the noodles, split the beans, cut the chocolate into uneven squares. Every plate got a little bit of something. The truckers didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They just sat up slowly and accepted it. The way you accept grace when it shows up in a place you didn't deserve. Mike, sitting near the window, raised his plastic fork and said, to the woman who fed 12 grown men with half a pantry and all her heart. Soft laughter followed. Grace shook her head, half smiling. Don't make me regret giving you the last square. They ate in silence after that. Not awkward, not strained, just the kind of silence that happens when people finally feel safe enough to stop talking. Thomas didn't eat much, but he held the chocolate square in his hand for a long time. Let it melt a little before taking a bite. Grace saw him close his eyes for half a second. She knew what that meant. She didn't interrupt. That moment was his. Somewhere near 2 in the morning, the lights flickered again. Leo flinched. So did Ray. But the power stayed. Just enough to keep the heater humming and the last pot of coffee warm. Mike turned on the radio. Static at first. Then an old country tune found its way through the white noise. A woman's voice, soft, raspy, singing about a road that never ends. Jack's hand found the mic again, but he didn't speak. Just tapped it gently. Let it sit near him like a totem. The young driver, barely 20, sat cross-legged on the floor near the jukebox. He looked up and asked, Is it always like this? I mean the road. The people. Ray nodded. When it's good, yeah. When it's bad, worse than you can imagine. But nights like this. He gestured around. They make it worth it. The boy didn't answer, just leaned his head back against the booth and closed his eyes. By dawn, most of them were asleep. Grace sat on the stool behind the counter, head resting on folded arms, eyes fluttering open and shut. Leo dozed in the kitchen, still wearing his apron. Thomas didn't sleep. He couldn't. He kept watch. Not because he had to, but because something inside him felt responsible. Like he was still that voice in the night. Still the one people counted on. At 5:47 a.m., the first crack of sunlight found its way through the frost on the windows. A quiet gold spread across the diner floor. The storm had passed, but no one moved. Not yet. They needed just a little longer. Grace finally stood, stretched slowly, walked to the front door. She looked out. Snow up to the knees. Sky clear. Highway still empty. She reached for the broom and started clearing the path. Not because she thought customers would come, but because it felt right. The world hadn't ended. It just paused long enough to remind them who they were. Somewhere down the highway, word had started to spread. Not because anyone tweeted or posted or sent a picture, but because truckers talk. Over radios, over diner tables, over handshakes and parking lot nods. Grace's place is still open. She took in 12 during the storm. Voice walkers back. Stories move fast when they matter, especially on the road, especially when you think no one's listening anymore. Grace didn't know what would happen next. She wasn't thinking about tomorrow. The bills were still on the table. The lease still unpaid. But none of it felt heavy. Not now, because that night they had made it. Together. Thomas rolled closer to the counter, set the mic back on the hook. Grace turned and met his eyes. You gonna say something? He thought for a second, then smiled. Already did. And that for now was enough. 2 days passed. The snow didn't melt, but it settled. Roads reopened. The sun came out in short bursts, just long enough to remind them the world was still turning. Grace didn't speak much. She swept the floors, boiled more coffee, restocked what little she could from the shelves out back. The pantry was still bare. The register still light. The coffee pot sputtered like it had arthritis. But the quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was just waiting. Thomas wiped tables slowly, moving in careful circles like muscle memory had finally returned. He didn't say why he was doing it. He just did. Leo mopped the floor, even though it was already clean. Ray had gone early that morning, nodding to Grace before stepping into the silence outside. She didn't ask if he'd be back. She just watched the path his boots left behind. There was no big conversation, no plan, just the quiet understanding that something had changed, and none of them wanted to be the one to break it. At 10:12 a.m., Grace heard it. Faint at first, a low rumble, like thunder with a heartbeat. She set down the broom. The sound grew louder. Tires over snow, brakes hissing, engines humming like some kind of promise being kept. She walked to the window. One truck, then another, then 5, then a dozen. It didn't stop. Chrome grills, long hauls, mud-streaked doors with familiar logos. Truckers stepped down, boots crunching over the hard snow. She opened the door without thinking. Mike was first. Same jacket, same grin. Hope you made more coffee, he said. Grace blinked, couldn't speak. Behind him, the others filed in. Not just the 12 from that night. More. New faces. Old faces. A few she remembered from years ago. Names she'd almost forgotten. Some nodded. Some smiled. One or two just tipped their hats like showing up was enough. It was. Thomas didn't move. He just stared, hands frozen mid-wipe. Then Mike stepped forward, pulled an envelope from his coat. Thick. Folded. Heavy. We passed the hat around, he said. Dispatchers, companies, drivers, even a few folks from the old radio days. They all heard. They remembered. He held out to Grace. It's enough. To keep the lights on. Start over. Whatever you need. Grace took it with both hands. Her fingers shook. She didn't open it. She didn't have to. The weight said everything. Another driver, older, silver beard, stepped up beside Mike. He held something wrapped in a cloth. Slowly, he unwrapped it. A CB, Mike Old. Scratched, but intact. He gave me this in '92, the man said. Middle of a blizzard. Mine had fried. He didn't ask questions. Just handed it over and kept driving. Said, better you than silence. I've kept it since. He looked at Thomas. Time it came home. Thomas stared at the mic like it was a ghost. He didn't reach for it. Not at first. Just blinked, lips parting, breath shallow. The man stepped forward, placed it gently on the table in front of him. No ceremony. No speech. Just gravity. Thomas's hand moved. Slowly. Fingers brushed the mic. Then curled around it. Tight. He didn't look up. Didn't say anything. Just held it. like it was the only thing in the world that made sense. And then, quietly, he began to cry. Not loud, not broken, just tears slipping down worn cheeks, catching in the lines time had carved into him. No one said a word. No one needed to. They all stood still, the air thick with something beyond words. Grace stepped closer, rested her hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch, just leaned slightly into her, like he'd finally stopped bracing for the crash. Mike clapped once. Not loud, but it broke the spell. Laughter followed. Relief, not noise. The diner filled fast. Boots stomped. Coats were shed. Coffee poured. Thomas stayed at his corner booth, Mike still in hand, eyes clearer than they'd been in years. Leo watched from behind the counter. He didn't say much, but he smiled. A small one. The kind you save for when something that was broken finally starts working again. Grace moved among the tables, apron on, sleeves rolled up. She didn't need a menu. She just knew what people wanted, what they needed. Plates hit tables. Stories flew across the room. Someone turned up the radio. The same old country station. Different song. Same warmth. One driver pulled Grace aside, held up his phone. "You're not going to believe how far this story's gone," he said. "East Coast. Canada. There's a guy in Florida saying he's driving up next week just to have a cup of your coffee." She laughed. Couldn't help it. "I hope he likes it bitter." Thomas finally set the mic down. Not far, just next to his coffee. He looked around the room, took it all in. The noise, the life. The way his name wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a presence. Something real. Something living. Grace leaned in, voice low. "You okay?" Thomas nodded. "Better than. You coming back?" "I never left," he said. And he meant it, because for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt like himself again. Not the man in the accident. Not the man in the chair. The voice. The anchor. The one who pulled people through the dark. And now, they had pulled him back. Not through sympathy, but through memory. Through recognition. Through something bigger than any of them could name. Outside, the for sale sign leaned forgotten against the fence. Snow drifted up around it, half burying the letters. Inside, Jack and Emily's wasn't just alive. It was burning. With stories. With people. With something that might not be magic, but sure as hell looked like it from here. 1 year later, the diner didn't just survive. It thrived. Trucks lined the side road before sunrise. Rigs from every direction, states away, some with plates Grace had never seen before. The parking lot stayed full. Mornings buzzed. Nights stayed warm, even in winter. The coffee never stopped brewing. The chairs never stayed empty. And the stories never stopped flowing. Leo ran the kitchen now. He moved faster, more confident. Learned to cook by instinct, not by recipe. People asked for him by name. Some even called ahead just to make sure he was on shift. He didn't talk much about the past, but he didn't hide from it anymore either. He kept a photo above the stove. 2 people in a truck, mid-laugh. His parents. He never said when he put it there. No one ever asked. Grace stayed at the front. She greeted every guest like they were regulars, even when she'd never seen their face. She knew who wanted decaf without asking. She could spot an empty stomach behind a brave face. She made space for the tired. She never turned anyone away. She didn't need to. Something about the place did the talking for her now. Thomas sat by the radio. Not every day. Not all day. Just enough. He didn't broadcast much anymore. But sometimes when the diner got quiet between rushes, he'd reach for the mic, press the button, and say something simple. Something like, "Mile marker 144. Hot coffee, warm booth. You're not too far gone to turn around." And sometimes people did. No explanation. Just a rig pulling in off the old highway, a driver getting out with sleep in their eyes, and a story too long to tell. They'd sit, eat, and leave something behind. Words, a name, a piece of the road. The walls were full of them now. Photographs. Signatures. A snapshot history written in faded ink and permanent marker. No one called it Grace and Thomas's Diner anymore. Most just called it what it had become. The place from the story. The one people talked about in radio chatter. The one that didn't close in the storm. The one where the old voice lives. A patch started showing up on jackets. Simple design. A steaming mug over a snowy road. No brand. No sponsor. Just an idea. A memory passed from driver to driver. If you ever find yourself lost, head toward the diner with the open door, the one that never closed, the one where the man in the corner booth still listens. Grace hung a new sign on the wall. It wasn't flashy, just white paint on old wood. It read, "This is where you come when the road forgets your name." Leo didn't like the poetry of it, but he never touched it, because people came in and nodded when they read it. Some even cried. One afternoon, a girl no older than 19 walked in with snow in her lashes. Said she heard about a place where strangers felt like home. She didn't stay long, just had soup, left at 20. But before she walked out, she said, "Thanks for keeping the light on." Grace didn't ask who sent her. She already knew. Word like that doesn't travel by GPS. It travels heart to heart. When the weather turns now, they don't panic. They just put more water in the soup and bring out the extra blankets. They've seen what storms can do. They also know what kindness can rebuild. Thomas still doesn't like being called a hero. He says he just did what needed doing. But every time someone hands him back a mic or a story or a name he helped remember, Grace sees it. The man he thought he lost is still there. Not every day, not always loudly, but always, when it counts. If this story moved you, take a second to share it. Leave a comment about someone who once helped you when you needed it most. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing stories like this into the light. One voice at a time, one open door at a time, one second chance at a time. Because sometimes all it takes to change everything is one night, one diner, and someone who refuses to close.